G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is the second part of the creature creation workshop, and it's time to put some meat on these bones. And these muscles that we're going to create can be used for all kinds of scenarios. So it can be used for simulation if you really want to do that sort of thing, or it can be used as a basis for a sculpt in the future, which is what we're going to do in part 3. And as you can see, I've got all kinds of references lined up in my viewport, just using nulls with images attached to them. So I've got some muscles for dinosaurs, birds, you name it. I'm going to go with a sort of bird-like structure for this because, well, it kind of just makes sense in my eyes. That being said, you can combo up any kinds of combinations of musculature from multiple kinds of animals. Okay, so the methods here are really straightforward. So to start off, just create a single plane and pop into edit mode. We're going to go ahead then and merge the verts on each side of that plane to create a single edge with 2 verts. We are then going to go ahead and subdivide that once to have a single point in the middle. And for the most part, this is all we'll need for the overall structure of our muscles. So what we're going to do now is just pop into our modifier tab and add a skin modifier. And what effectively happens is that it converts our single edge into a solid block. And if you hold down Command and A or Control and A, you can then scale down the ends of each vert along that edge. And what we now have is basically all the structure we need to create a muscle-like shape. All you gotta do now is add a subdivision surface underneath the skin modifier, and then we basically have what is effectively a muscle. Now what I've gone ahead and done is duplicated the muscle and then added a mirror modifier on top. And now all I'm doing is really just positioning the muscle shapes to fit the anatomy of my dragon. Now, that's basically it for the majority of this piece. Now, there is going to be another method to add to this for sort of more flatter muscles. We're going to get to that in a moment. But as you can see, the method now is pretty straightforward, just duplicating that muscle in edit mode and then tweaking the thickness of the muscle as we go ahead. And I've also added a subdivision surface on the top of my layer stack or my modifier stack to give it a little bit more smoothness around those edges. So what you can see here is a really soft, squishy looking muscle to play with. Now, in order to get that sort of red color in the viewport, all I've done is added a material, and in the viewport settings of that material, I've given it a red color. That's basically it. So really straightforward way of visualizing the muscles in a sort of semi-realistic way in the viewport is to essentially just give it a viewport color as a material. So to make life easier as well, what I've done is I've split my viewport into 2 parts. I've got my edit side and then I've got my sort of visualization side. I generally always model in this sort of method as well, where I can see all the verts and all my wireframes and all that sort of stuff on the left side. And then on the other side, I just have a sort of non-obstructed viewport to sort of see everything from afar. This is a nice way to work because it just removes any obstruction, and it avoids any sort of macro mistakes that you may make as you look closer and closer to your model. So as you can see here, I'm effectively just tracing the bone structure of the bones with the muscles, trying to cover up the bones where I can. And I'm also using the references both on my screen or in my viewport and in my secondary monitor to sort of get a semi-realistic approximation of the muscles. I'm not trying to be super accurate here because, of course, what I have is a fantasy creature and I'm not too concerned about 100% realism of where muscle groups would go. But I want to get a nice impression of volume and where potentially the muscles would sort of link up with the bone structure. But as you can see, even if I'm just sort of guessing my way through this, it still kind of feels somewhat realistic where sort of the glutes would go, where the hamstrings would go, where the quads would go, all that sort of thing. So it's not too bad. Okay, so there is a different kind of muscle group that we kind of have to create here as well. And this is sort of like a giant sheet muscle. And this is a little bit different to the first muscle that we made in that it's just going to be a single plane rather than a set of edges. So I've added a subdivision just to give it a bit more softness. And then after that, I'm going to add a solidify modifier. And this will give it thickness. But it's going to be a uniform thickness and we want to give it a bit of a taper. And we're going to use a vertex group to help us control that taper in this shape. And if you want to, you can add a second subdivision surface to give it even more softness after you've added the solidify to sort of smooth out those edges a little bit. So I'm just tinkering with the settings just to see what works best. So I've added a keep boundaries, keep corners option on the first subdivision just to keep those corners relatively sharp. And now what I'm going to do is work out the thickness of that sheet of muscle. As you can see in my references here, that sort of muscle is going to sit around the chest and around the torso. So it's more about those big sort of sections rather than the sort of parts that would flex in massive ways. So what I'm going to do is just make a backup of this object for now. I'm going to duplicate that and then sort of mirror it with a mirror modifier. I'm just going to take stock of what I've done so far, make sure all the settings are the way I want them to be, and just make sure I'm happy with everything. Make sure the stack is stacked in the right way so the mirror goes on top, that sort of thing. Just to make things nice and clean and optimized when we're working with this sort of stuff. And just tweaking with the values according to what I think looks okay. All right, so as you can see here now, I'm jumped into edit mode, and now I'm going to add some vertex groups, and these will help us control the thickness of the muscle along the edges of that muscle. So I'm just going to call that vertex group thickness, and I'm going to assign that to every vert in the muscle at the moment with a 0 weight value. All right, I'm then going to select the middle verts and give it a weight of 1. And if I jump into my solidify settings now in my modifier stack and then enable the thickness as a vertex group, you can see now the muscle has thickness in the middle and then a taper toward the edges. And you can modify those values in the vertex groups to be as thick or as thin as you want them to be, or you can edit the modifier itself. But once you're happy, you can start to line up the muscle. And as you can see, it's a pretty easy breezy process from now on. Now, every now and then you may have to go ahead and sort of realign some of the bones to make the muscle fit. And that's okay at this point because this is still really a blocking phase. And then from now on in, it's really just using a combination of our first set of muscle types with the sheet muscle type, and then sort of balancing them out together across the body. And that's basically it for the overall structure of the skeleton. As you can see, I'm basically using the same mesh types throughout my model design. So the thing is now is just be patient and start to line up all those muscles. And you can be as detailed or as little detail as you need, depending on what character you're creating. And I'm just making according to whatever I've designed. This took me approximately about 2 hours to do. Now, depending on whether or not you feel super confident as a sculptor, you could probably smash out a whole design in 2 hours sometimes if you're really good at this sort of stuff. But for those who are just starting out, this is a great way to sort of block out those muscle groups if you're not super familiar with them without having to break it down while you're sculpting. And you'll find in the next video, once we sort of re-topo this or, mesh this thing, the musculature will sort of be inherited from this blocking stage. And the great thing is, of course, is that you have this backup as well. So you can actually edit this in the future if you want to create another creature. You've got the template ready to go, and you can sort of block out the rest and move things around to sort of fit that new skeleton that you may make for another creature. So this is a nice, flexible way to sort of get an understanding of the musculature and that sort of thing. So what I'm doing now is I'm just filling out the gaps in between the parts I haven't added muscle as well. So I might add some geometry in between the mouth and in between the torso to sort of give it a bit of solidity, because in the future, what we're going to do is remesh this thing as a single object that we can sculpt on. And that's basically it for this pass of the process. So we've got all our musculature in there. So now it's probably a good idea to go ahead and create a backup folder. So what we're going to do is duplicate the bone collection. We're going to duplicate the musculature collection and any other parts that we may have created. So maybe the eyeballs or the inside of the body. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is apply all the modifiers. And as you can see now, all those simple pieces of geometry have now been converted to the actual geometry that has been generated from the modifiers. Now, before we go ahead and remesh this in the next video, we need to make sure that sort of everything connects and is what is called manifold, I guess you can say. It's not technically manifold until we remesh it, but once we get rid of any of the gaps, it makes it a little bit easier to remesh this in an effective way with a voxelization process. So I'm just going to go into edit mode and just tweak, say, the wing bones to connect with the musculature inside of that creature. And I can also use the sculpting tools to sort of inflate the muscles a little bit to get them to connect a little bit more as well and get a little bit of overlap. So as you can see here, I'm going ahead into edit mode, selecting that bone structure and just getting that overlap to work and making sure that I'm in mirror mode to do that as well. If it's not working, you can always symmetrize the mesh as well. So select everything, go to mesh, symmetrize, and that will basically symmetrize the whole creature a little bit. So when you do use the mirroring in edit mode, it will mirror effectively. So I'm just going ahead and just making sure everything is overlapping nicely, because we want to have that as a nice basis for sculpting in the next video. So just going ahead, tweaking things up, making sure everything's connected nicely. And that's about it for this as well. Again, I'm doing the same thing in the claws, making sure the talons are all sort of connected. I will inflate this in the next video as well, because they kind of look like a little bit too bird-like, but that's okay for now. I'm happy with what I've got. And that's about it. Now, of course, if you are tweaking this sort of stuff and you're not quite happy with what you got so far, it's always good that if you have that backup collection that you've made earlier, you can always go back and edit things in a more simplistic way, or you can go ahead and sculpt on top of this a little bit before we voxelize it. It's really up to you. The nice thing about when you join all this stuff together, it kind of keeps the materials there as well. So if you want to unwrap this thing, I'm using auto unwrapping, and it's some very simple node setup to create that muscle lines. Here's a cheeky little screenshot to see what I've done. Pretty straightforward little setup, but feel free to have a look. This is by no means realistic. It's just a very simple little visualization tool for me to see how things are looking. But feel free to give it a go. Now, one of the great things about using the skin modifier and the solidify modifier and that sort of thing is that if your geometry is clean, like it was when we created the edges and stuff like that, really simplistic, the geometry that's generated is all quads. So you can actually rig this thing pretty easily and get some pretty nice deformation out of the box. Now, in the previous video, I already rigged up the skeleton, right? I already rigged up everything. The controls are all working. So I thought I'd give it a go and see how this looks in animation. And you can see in the final output here that the animation, once it's skinned, is pretty damn good out of the box. So in terms of rigging up these skeletons and rigging up these muscles, it's actually quite straightforward if you have the auto skinning working well out for you. I'm using a plugin to do the skinning for me, but you can see here the deformations are working really, really well. That being said, I am going to convert this into a single piece of geometry in the next video, but just for a bit of fun, you can see it's all working really, really, really well, which is pretty cool. Yeah, all right. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and voxelize this thing, turn it into a single piece of geometry, and then we're going to add a sculpting pass on top of this to get all that detail into the skin, into the eyes, into the mouth, all that sort of cool stuff. And you can see that we have a really clean base to work from. Now, of course, if you like this video and you want to get the source files, feel free to sign up to my Patreon, where you get the working files, the animation files, the rig, and the ad-free content, all up for grabs. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give a like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification for more. Catches and have fun. And for those who have already signed up for my Patreon, I appreciate it. Every little bit of support helps make more content, so thank you very much.